Today, we're going to be talking about police body cameras and how they can really impact how police, do their jobs.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think something so small can make such a big difference.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, we're looking at this research paper from back in 2015. It's
Yeah.
called The Effect of Police Body-Worn Cameras on Use of Force and Citizens' Complaints Against the Police, a randomized controlled trial. So they really wanted to know if those cameras made a difference, out on the streets. And it turns out it's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think what makes this study so strong is that it was a randomized controlled trial. So, you can really be confident in the findings.
Okay, so before we even get into that, though, can we talk about, why we should even care about police use of force and complaints? It seems like it's always in the news.
Well, it really comes down to this idea of like a social contract between the police and the public.
Hmm.
We give police the power to use force, but we expect them to do it responsibly and only when it's really necessary. But when that trust is broken, it can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, for sure. It's about making sure the police are accountable for how they act. And I guess complaints from the public are one way to, track how well that's going. So tell me a bit more about how they actually did this study.
Okay, so they worked with the police department in Rialto, California, and they randomly assigned almost 1,000 police shifts to either wear a camera or not. So that was like the experimental group versus the control group. And they did it by shift instead of by officer because the officers in Rialto work in like rotating teams and it just made it easier to manage.
Okay, got it. So what did they find out? Did the cameras really live up to all the hype?
You bet they did. The results were really impressive. The shifts where the officers didn't have cameras
Yeah.
were twice as likely to involve use of force.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So even though they couldn't really measure exactly how much force was used each time, it seems clear that those cameras really made officers think twice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about use of force either.
Yeah.
Citizen complaints dropped like crazy during the study. Before the study, there were like zero point 0.7 complaints for every 1,000 interactions with the public. But during the experiment, that number went down to just zero point zero 0.07. But that's almost like 10 times less.
Okay, that's incredible. I mean, that right there really shows you these cameras can change how the police and the public interact. But I'm curious, like, how do we know if it was the officers acting differently or the citizens acting differently because of the cameras?
That is a great question. And what's really cool is that even the officers in those control shifts, the ones without cameras, they had fewer use of force incidents and fewer complaints against them. It's like this ripple effect. So it made the researchers think about something called the Hawthorne effect.
Okay, can you remind me what that is again?
Basically, it means people tend to act differently when they know they're being watched, even if they're not being recorded at that very moment. So just the possibility of being recorded might have made everyone behave better.
That's a really good point. I mean, it makes you think that just the idea of transparency can be really powerful. Like, it doesn't even have to be about catching people doing something wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's more about encouraging good behavior in the first place.
That's really interesting.
It definitely is. There's a lot more going on here than you might think. Now, of course, no study is perfect, right?
For sure.
This one had some limitations, too. Like, it was hard to say for sure whether it was the officers changing their behavior or the citizens or maybe both. And also, they had to rely on those official police reports, which, aren't always completely accurate.
I see what you mean. But even so, those findings are pretty amazing. So what do you think all of this means for policing going forward?
I think when you look at the big picture, these findings have some pretty serious implications. Body cameras could really change the game in terms of trust between the police and the community
Mm.
and making sure police are held accountable for their actions. Plus, they could be a great way to train officers, too.
And there's that whole cost thing too, right? I remember something about them actually saving money in the long run.
Yeah, you're right. The study found that for every dollar spent on body cameras,
Mm.
you could save like $4 because of things like fewer complaints and legal costs.
Wow. So it's good for trust, accountability, and even saves money. It seems like there's a lot to like. But I guess it can't all be good news, right? What are some of the concerns people have about using these cameras all the time?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something we should definitely talk about because there is a flip side to all of this, too. It's kind of like, there's a lot of potential good here, but
Hmm.
we got to be careful about, you know, some of the other things that come along with using all this technology.
Yeah, like what are we talking about here? What are some of the things to watch out for?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones is privacy, right? Like if we're recording all these interactions with the public, even people who aren't, doing anything wrong, kind of makes you wonder, where do we draw the line? How do we protect people's privacy?
Yeah. It's a slippery slope, isn't it? Like, we don't want to live in a world where every single thing you do around a police officer is being filmed.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you think about like domestic violence situations or, someone having a mental health crisis. You don't want that camera to scare people away from getting the help they need.
So how do we figure that out then? It sounds like finding that balance is really important.
I think the key is to be really open with the public, you know,
Yeah.
have honest conversations about how you're using these cameras and make sure people's rights are protected.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, building trust is so important, and you can't do that without being transparent. So you mentioned earlier that the study used those official police reports to track things like use of force and complaints, but they said there were some problems with that approach, right?
Oh, yeah, you're right. One of
Huh.
the big things was that those reports only show what actually gets reported.
Hmm.
There's always a chance that some stuff gets missed. Or maybe there's even some bias in how those reports are written.
So how can we get a better idea of what's really going on? Are there other ways to, figure out the impact of these cameras?
Hmm, that's a tough one. Maybe we could try asking the officers and the public directly, you know, like do some surveys to see how they feel about the cameras.
Oh, yeah, that's a good idea. You could ask the officers, how they think the cameras have changed their interactions and if it's made them do their jobs differently.
And you could ask the people in the community too. Like, did they feel like they were treated fairly? Did the camera make them act differently?
Right, it's all about getting different perspectives.
Totally. It can't just be about the numbers. We need to understand what it's like for both the officers and the people they're interacting with.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There are also other methods like interviews and focus groups, and you could even have researchers ride along with officers to see how they use the cameras in real life.
Yeah. Wow, that's pretty intense. It sounds like we really need to be creative to get a clear picture of how these cameras are impacting things. Oh, and speaking of getting the full picture, let's talk about some of the other costs involved with these cameras. I know you mentioned something about storage and managing all that video footage.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge issue. These cameras create a ton of data, and it can get really expensive to store it all
Yeah.
and make sure it's organized and secure.
So it's not just about buying the cameras, it's like a whole system you have to set up.
Exactly. And for smaller police departments that don't have a lot of money,
Yeah.
that can be a real problem.
Yeah, I can see that.
Plus, there's the whole legal side of things, too. Like, what happens to all that footage if a case goes to court? Does the defense get to see everything? What if there's no footage of something? Does that mean the case gets thrown out?
It's like the cameras are creating a whole new set of legal questions.
Totally. It's a whole new world we're moving into.
Mm.
There are going to be a lot of legal issues to work out.
Yeah, it seems like a really complicated intersection of technology and the law.
Yeah, it is. But it's something we need to keep talking about.
Okay, so it sounds like what we're learning is these cameras can be really good, but we got to be smart about how we use them.
Absolutely. It's about maximizing the benefits and minimizing the risks. And to do that, we need to have a lot of conversations with the police and the community and figure out what works best for everyone. It's funny how just knowing someone might be watching can change how people act.
Yeah, so if police officers and citizens know they could be on camera, they might think twice before doing something stupid.
Right. It's not even about, actually catching them in the act. It's about encouraging everyone to be on their best behavior all the time.
So it's kind of like changing the whole culture of law enforcement. Instead of being all secretive, we're making it more open and accountable.
Exactly. And I think this idea of transparency is important in other areas too, not just policing.
Oh, yeah, like what?
Well, think about like the government, healthcare, education, even our own personal relationships could benefit from more transparency.
That's a good point. When things are out in the open, it's harder for people to abuse their power or take advantage of others.
Yeah, and transparency isn't just about preventing bad things from happening. It can also help build trust and make things run more smoothly.
So when people feel like they can speak openly and honestly, it creates a more positive environment for everyone.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really interesting deep dive. We started with this one study about body cameras, but it's really made us think about some bigger questions about technology and ethics and the future of policing.
It has been fascinating, and hopefully our listeners learned a lot too.
Yeah, I think so. It seems like the conversation about body cameras is just getting started, and we all have a role to play in figuring out how to use them responsibly. So here's something to think about. If something as small as a camera can have such a big impact, what other ways can we use technology to make the world a better place? Until next time, keep diving deep.